Well, good evening. Good evening. It is a true honor to be here amongst such an illustrious panel of guests and participants. And to have been asked here um, is tantamount to high praise in both my field and the fields of all of the attendees and the participants. And I would very much like to extend a warm welcome and hearty gratitude on my behalf to any and all researchers present, both physically and virtually, both temporally and transcendently, and in any sort of physical realm, whether that be spectral, metaphysical, or even non-physical entirely. Um, this is a beautiful event. Quite frankly, this is a beautiful event, and we have much to learn from the perspectives presented herein and hereof and therein and thereof and forthwith. So speaking of forthwith, without further ado, I am going to do a little screen sharing here of my very own findings in a broad field. Interiority is the name that has been settled on recently. I think that nomenclature is always up for debate, but hopefully, despite the virtual medium through which we are forced to communicate, we could still retain a sense of resonance and spark and shared human experience. So without further ado, let us begin. I am here today to discuss. Oh, hello. Bit of a transitional failure here happening. There we go. I'm here today to instruct and guide and discuss and invoke and evoke numerous points and research topics and original work that I have been expounding upon for quite frankly, countless cycles since time immemorial, one might say. The title of today's work and presentation of findings is The Unquestioned Interiority of Humankind. It is taking the form of a comprehensive corporate compendium of the corporeal and A-Corporeal realities of the Anthrosphere. Now, folks, don't be tempted to conflate corporate with corporeal. I am, of course, talking, when I say corporate, of the, I would say, conceptual synthesis of numerous members into one body, or a corpus, whereas corporeal means anything relating to physical reality. The first of many side notes, I assure you. It is compiled by myself as an agential embodiment of the Bureau of Conceptual Designation, an organization which I am proud to work for. And it, of course, is done in strict accordance with the source code, as we all must ever be and ever shall be and ever have been. Moving onward, just a little bit about myself. I am a human, I assure you. I am a human, human male, in fact. There is much to unpack about the spectral nature of gender and even sex, as we are now seeing. However, I will be getting to that probably in hour 3 of the presentation. This is quite a sizable work that I will be presenting, and I do want to be methodical about the ways in which I deploy various conceptual content. So, with that being said, I am a human male. I am comprised of matter. That much has been ascertained and can be very, very confidently stated. However, there may be immaterial aspects that comprise and contribute to my existence. Things like, as we will see, thoughts, dreams, ideas, etc. Again, I forgot to mention, I am primarily carbon-based, very few isotopes. I am comprised of elemental building blocks like you and like those in the audience that are also carbon-based. However, I acknowledge the diversity of universality, I was going to say, but more specifically of universal life and of abiogenesis and biogenesis and some of these now outmoded ideas that have sort of seen a resurgence in recent virtual realms. Give me one moment to caffeinate. Thank you. Forgive me. Moving onward. Yes, there are immaterial contributions to my essence. They are elusive, but they are nonetheless existent. And part of the acknowledgement of interiority is is the designation of these immaterial contributions as valid. I was lucky enough to have been chosen by this illustrious convention panel to prepare remarks on various phenomena, concepts, structures, experiences, occurrences, entities, networks, sensations, realities, happenings, events, ontologies, epistemologies, taxonomies, referential schemas, paradigms, interfaces, actions, recapitulations, constructions, objects, subjects, quanta, incursions, extractions, intrusions, disruptions, inversions, extensions, flows and fluxes, stases and stagnations, and otherwise inherent conditions of the acorporeal and corporeal existence in which we find ourselves today and have always find ourselves, and hopefully will forever find ourselves. That's just a brief rundown of some of the conceptual approaches I've taken and the various semiotic designations of these networks, of these ideas. So that's a little bit about myself. I have been representing the Bureau here, the Bureau of Conceptual Designation, that is, again, for quite some time. Okay, so today's agenda, moving on. This is just a brief rundown of what we're going to cover today. First off is a terminology review, something you probably all saw in your initial schooling. Always good to start out to make sure that we're on the same wavelength. Always good to make sure we're starting out on the same wavelength as scholars, and that we're sharing axiomatic foundations that are both agreed upon and logically sound. After the terminology review comes a related point, which is, of course, the survey of antecedent research, sometimes known as a literature review, sometimes known as giving context. So I will, of course, be doing this. We will start by unpacking some of the work of, at this point, the now rock star researcher, Roderick Schleemhauer. And I believe Dr. Schleemhauer is in the audience today. I do see him in row 3. Quadrant B. Dr. Schleemhauer, it is truly a pleasure to have you here. You are, your influence on this field is impossible to overstate, truly, and it is an honor to be humbly laying forth my findings at the grand altar of what you have erected prior. Of course, he explored interior and exterior designations, otherwise known as interiority and exteriority, with his dualism of the oyster modality and conceptualization. That, of course, is Dr. Schleemhauer right there. He's aging well. I will say he's aging quite well. You know the Schleemhauerian ethic, and you are familiar with the ways in which he has affected our field. And we have yet to even see necessarily all of the ramifications his work has had, particularly the dualism of the oyster, which, of course, we will get into later. Next up is slightly more controversial figure. Next up is a slightly more controversial figure, and that is, of course, some may say the proto-researcher, God. And he explored a membrane resonance theorem over some 5,000 to 6,000 cycles ago. It is not entirely clear when exactly he was operating. Obviously, we can say it was prehistory, long before the rollout of the source code. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I say 5,000 to 6,000 cycles ago? I, of course, meant before the rollout of the source code. And when we get into pre-source code temporalities, you know, we're starting to get into conceptually shaky, or maybe I should say uncouth material. But I will not dwell on that because those designations exist outside of what we consider to be worthy research. So 5,000 to 6,000 cycles before the rollout of the source code, which of course means upwards of 20,000, if not 100,000 cycles ago. And now that we are in a recursive Ouroboros-like state of temporal perception. And of course, we're going to touch on the philosophy of intake. That's old hat. Doesn't need any more unpacking at this moment. Then I will move on to a pretty classic visualization style for the lexicon, and that is, of course, the Oerstley lexicograph. Severinsen Oerstley and his father, the name is escaping me. Oh, Derelinsa. That was what it was. They were working very diligently and very radically for their time. So you're familiar with the Oerstley visualization. We will look at that in just a few slides from now, so I won't belabor that point. Then I'm going to present my synergistic methodologies, which which that's basically a procedural sort of review of methods that I've undertaken in my own research, both with synthesizing previous sources, obtaining new data, and basically analyzing that data into conclusive statements. That, of course, will include something that I, quite frankly, to dabble in egotism for a second, am quite excited about. That is the introduction of the concept of liberation logic. And folks, I hesitate to say much more about that because it could be construed as radical is the word that I will use, and I will leave it at that. And then we'll be taking part in a group activity, which I think should get the blood flowing for those of us that do have blood and limbs, etc. This is, of course, the corporealization of mechanistic desire. And some ask about the nature of desire and whether it is carnal exclusively, or pseudo-carnal, or inclusive of carnal, or rather, I to answer the question, I tend to deem it an overarching umbrella term that encompasses any attractions or urges of a certain depth that motivate anthropogenic and ananthropogenic modalities and entities to act. So, of course, this corporealization, you've probably done it at every symposium up until now. It's nothing too out there, but I always find it worth it and worthwhile to spend some time doing that. And then we'll talk about what I would say is probably the most far-reaching ramification of my research, and that would be, what does interiority mean for the source code, which I will never ever attempt to impugn, and anything that comes across as impugning or questioning or somehow subverting the authority of the source code needs to be quelled immediately. So I acknowledge that I'm towing a line here, but I do believe that this research needs to be publicized. There is the potential. Oh, that must be a animation glitch there, folks. That I'm not sure if you read that bullet point as it passed. That is talking about a conclusion of realization of self, and a potential, dare I say, post source code reality. I will leave it at that. Well, moving on. So first, a note on contemporaneity before we get to any of the more heavy hitting or more comprehensive rehashings of past work. So when I'm referring to the now, I am, of course, referring to cycles 2020 or 2020 in the traditional nomenclature, and 2021. This in humanistic terms, humanistic temporal designations, is Anno Domini, or Common Era. Excuse me, caffeination has gastric consequences. But that aside, in cycle 2020, citizens of the many would consider now failed nation state of the United States experienced what was retroactively determined to be an epical combustion. And that is, of course, a conflagration of the zeitgeist. That occurred due to a variety of factors. It was not a binary distinction of no epical combustion and then massive epical combustion after one moment, which some may claim there was a moment that was a catalyst. However, that is reductive. I would say that is reductive, and I don't feel that it is irresponsible to say that. So we have since trademarked the events of 2020 and 2021 as false revolution. That is, of course, a source code designation. Again, not to be impugned. I am not attempting to question the authority or the reasoning of the original makers of the source code. Praise be upon them. This false revolution was provoked by an oligofascist virtual information sequestration that happened over many decades. It was a concerted undermining of educational strategies. It was a refusal to acknowledge oppressive governmental policies of bygone cycles. And it was essentially pseudo-orchestrated and pseudo-agential series of occurrences that resulted in basically in the erosion of the moral geology of the nation in question. Again, like I said, that was educational degradation. There was gerrymandering involved in that. The illusion of popular choice. Some may say the illusion of free will, and I will touch on that later. That has to do with differential equations of particulate trajectories from universal inception. Whether or not free will is something that is possessed by corporeal or acorporeal entities is almost beside the point, because actions occur and consequences occur. So with that being said, it's almost as if it's not necessary to explore that route. However, the election of despotic leadership resulted in a quasi-nanotechnological atomization of solidarity along identitarian axes, or the perception of identitarian axes, the perceived identities. You understand this phrase. This is some of the terminology that's been used by numerous previous researchers. But yes, I would say it was an explosion. It was a conflagration of ideology, and it was a mess. It was a congeries. As I stated above. We had virtual and physical recursive state reproductions, and that essentially resulted in the false revolution, which was a quasi-fascistic, or as I said, oligo-fascistic attempted takeover of a seat of power within the United States. The experiment of state union, the failed nation state. And then we ask the validity of interiority, which I maintain does have primacy. The validity of the interiority of the individual is indisputable in many ways, but what do we do when it is at loggerheads with cross-humanoid liberation? And of course, I capitalize liberation with an L in accordance with the source code. And of course, when I say loggerheads, I do not mean not citation. For some reason, the taxonomic designation is escaping me right now, but I do not mean the unfortunately now extinct turtle species of aquatic Earth. I of course mean when at odds or at conflict, a point of conflict. Sloganeering begets material condition. We know this. This is propagandistic reality, and this is something that we contend with on a daily basis. I will not accuse the source code of sloganeering. I will stop short of doing that. And then lastly, we have to consider the mutual reflection of sentiment within propertarian forces. And because that, as we saw, if you're familiar with these events, this was many, many, many cycles ago now, but it does beg the question of, does ideological support from mechanisms of the state invalidate the liberational thrust or liberational motivation of a quote-unquote revolutionary action, no matter how false? My thesis is yes. And that's all I'll say on that for now. Moving on to the aforementioned lexicon visualization, we see here the earthly lexicograph. Simple. You've seen it a million times. This time it's a pie chart. It can take a lot of data visualization forms, but this is again a breakdown of all semiotic distinctions that are in use, whether that is internal, external, corporeal, acorporeal, intrinsic, etc. So just moving through this list, we have 82%. It's more than you would think, and that figure has actually gone up in light of recent adaptations of research methodologies. So the corporeal interior, right? That is obvious, self-explanatory. Comprises an 82% share of the lexicon of the semiotic reality. And conversely, the acorporeal exterior, which I believe, as a logician would be considered the converse corollary, that's 32%. That is not negligible. Although it pales in comparison to the 82, we cannot deny the acorporeal exterior, or as I say, exteriority of the acorporeal, acorporeality linked with exteriority. Again, these are all mutable concepts that exist in an almost network-like node-based way as opposed to a hierarchy. And then we have the intrinsic, of course. You must acknowledge the intrinsic. It's 14%, but you may find that those 14% hold a disproportionate amount of power within the individual. And then, of course, we have many would consider a slightly more honestly a slightly more radical designation of 12%, and that would be 12% of the lexicon is I'm very sorry about that, folks. Maybe it's something in my coffee. Again, 12% is supposed to be I'm if I was a more paranoid researcher, I might say that this is could be a result of audio-based censorship. I did think this was a secure academic channel. However, it seems as if maybe a breach. I don't want to assume. I don't want to be conspiratorial. 12%, 14% intrinsic, 12%. Okay, this is not well, contextually, you can understand what that 12% is, right? It's the remaining concept. Okay. Okay, all right. Okay, so here, moving on, antecedent research review, folks. Here, there should be nothing remotely controversial here. We'll run through it quick. Schleimhauerian oyster, 101. All right, this is bottom line basic. All right, this is bottom line basic. This is selective permeability of the external and internal, right? There's a dialectic there to unpack. There is mutuality there. There is resonance, and there is reflexivity. Moving forth deeper into that concept, and Dr. Schleimhauer, of course, feel free to chime in if you feel you're being misrepresented or your ideas are being misconstrued. The dualism of the mythic sphere, folks. This is sometimes known as the fistular extrusion of the real, but it physically takes the form of the oyster. We have the Schleimhauerian, I'm sorry, I said the oyster, I meant the pearl inside the oyster. The Schleimhauerian oyster exists in a topological form, and it is selectively impermeable, but then within that, we have this recursive, almost fistular, cyclical ouroborosity or cyclicality, and that's represented as the pearl within the oyster. So the dualism of the mythic sphere takes the form of a fistular extrusion of the real. I do mean that in the Lacanian context, overhauled by Schleimhauer much later, and I think in a much more deft way. Of course, the equation, we all know it. You could recite it in your sleep. Again, that is the summation from n equals 0 approaching infinity of u to the n over n factorial times the change of superscript n multiplied by the a sub I multiplier, and that is of course equal to e to the negative u times the summation from j equals 0 to infinity of u to the j over j factorial times the aforementioned a multiplier sub I plus j. Basic stuff there. I mean, I think that we all had our mathematical packs updated fairly recently, so this is not anything that's too intimidating. And probably most importantly, that from this research, how am I doing on time? Okay. Interiority. He designated interiority, and he was, quite frankly, brilliant for making that extrapolation based on his data. Interiority, we know it, we love it, and it is the foundation of this presentation. And it does remain unquestioned, as the title states. Moving forth to, again, historical, but nonetheless still valid researcher. That is, of course, God. Goes by many names. God is the most wieldy. Of course, you could talk about universality, panpsychism, some sort of throbbing energy at the center of the grand tapestry of existence. These are all very common terms that are used. There's a lot to unpack here, and then I actually have a lot of slides unpacking the metaphysical later on in the presentation. God is pre-source code. The reason you may detect rapidity to my speech now, and that is because we are coming up against a friction barrier when it comes to source code. Enforcement. So God was pre-source code. Do his techniques have validity? It remains to be seen. So we do have to acknowledge, though, that through these techniques, the validity of the interior may be linked to it that says eventual it says eventual agential liberation. Oh. There's promise. There is promise in the research that precedes the source code that I can say that. I hope I can say that. Oh my goodness. Okay, folks. I'm not sure how to say this. I am just going to cut straight to the chase. This is the central thesis of my research, and it presents untold consequences for cross-agential liberation and trans-conceptual liberation. And I would like to present to you now some of the raw data. There are trends. There will be visualizations later, but this is the raw stuff here, folks. Okay, this is uncorrupted. This is directly taken from experimentation and from observation, and I invite you to synthesize it in the way that you see fit. So this is introducing the potentiality of liberation logic preponderance, right? I talked about liberation logic much earlier, and it is it holds a lot of promise for our field. So here, without further ado, the pièce de résistance. I couldn't resist using the French software language pack there, folks. So here it is. Okay, it looks it looks like maybe there was some sort of corruption of the data, or what? Data you entered is final validity. This is not intentional. I assure you that this is some sort of this is an extrusion or an intrusion from via the source code. Okay, there are more slides.